I recently had the good fortune to interview a gentleman named Dr. Yoram Hazony. Dr. Hazony is an American originally, but he's now an Israeli. He lives not in trendy Tel Aviv. He actually lives in Jerusalem. He's an Orthodox Jew. He has 9 kids. And there's a word for that, or phrase for that, called skin in the game. Dr. Hazony has a new book out called The Virtue of Nationalism, and I had heard quite a bit about this book, and I went out and got it and read it, and I was particularly interested in it because it contains some references to both the aforementioned Friedrich Hayek and also one of our own mentors at the Mises Institute, Ludwig von Mises. And so while I disagreed with portions of the book, especially his characterizations, I think, of what Hayek and Mises would think of modern nation states and their characterization or thought of what a liberal society, liberal in the good sense, what a liberal society would look like. Although I disagreed with it somewhat, I really, really enjoyed the book, and I really enjoyed interviewing him. And one of the great points that he makes in the book is that for a lot of the world, liberalism, as we think of it, Western social democracy, is a form of imperialism. It's a form of neocolonialism just as much as it was when we went to India, or England went to India and told them how to structure their government with a parliament, or when certain countries went to Nigeria and took their diamonds. This is a form of neocolonialism or neo-imperialism. And more importantly, it's a form of hubris, right, if we think about it, because conservatives, liberals, socialists, even libertarians, all of them have their own universalist ideas, their own notions of universal precepts, political and otherwise, that ought to apply across national boundaries, actually even ought to apply across time, because you now see criticisms of, let's say, Christopher Columbus by modern liberal standards. So I think universalism is bunk. And I think more than that, it's hubris. And so to the extent that Dr. Hazony's book makes that point, it's a very important one to make. And sometimes we forget that while those of us who are anti-war and anti-intervention think of the U.S. federal government as an imperial force of sorts with respect to the rest of the world, we forget it's also, D.C. is also imperial with respect to the states, right? It is every bit as much an empire over the states and ruling them in an illegal fashion as it is, let's say, some of the Middle Eastern countries it occupies. And so when it comes to this idea of universalism, I saw a great tweet the other day. I'm sure some of you know Nassim Taleb. He's the author of The Black Swan, which was a very famous book about crashes and certainty and probability and risk. He's a brilliant guy, and he's very much a contrarian, which I enjoy. And so he tweeted something to this effect. He said, if I had to describe my politics, it would be this. He said, I'm libertarian at the federal level, I'm Republican at the state level, I'm a Democrat at the local level, and I'm a socialist at the family and friends level. And I thought that was really an interesting take, because more and more I'm starting to think that localism is the answer for those of us who care about liberty, because if you look at the last election, the last national presidential election, it takes about 70 million people to vote for your candidate to win the presidency in the United States. And that's a pretty big enchilada. So I'm not confident about the idea that Rothbardian libertarianism is going to necessarily prevail amongst 71 million Americans, at least in the near future. So, small revolution. Why small? Why do I advocate a small revolution? Well, first and foremost, I think as been discussed earlier today, I think smaller polities are better polities, and we'll get to that in a moment. But also small in the sense that I think there are actually a million small, incremental, almost invisible, subtle steps that could be taken along the way to making us freer that don't necessarily take the form of a mechanical secession or a war or all kinds of things that were discussed earlier today. There are a lot of problems, and I'm the first to admit it, although I'm a big advocate of secession. There are a lot of problems with some of the issues we're talking about today in terms of mechanical or technical solutions to breaking up. As for whether we're on the verge of a civil war, a hot shooting war? I don't know. I certainly hope we don't, and I don't like it when people speak about it in a flip manner. I think that's really evil, and I think that's also a symbol of a very soft society that's never had real material hardship. We're not the same as our great-grandparents who labored through the Great Depression. We're not as tough as they are. Let's not kid ourselves. Virtually everyone in this room is woken up every day with hot and cold running water, some sort of decent habitation over their head, probably a vehicle, food in the refrigerator, etc. So we shouldn't kid ourselves about our toughness in shooting and killing people. I think that's dangerous. But more importantly, it's predicted the next 30 years, the amount of Americans over 65 is going to double. So usually revolutionary societies are younger societies. And I think if we're going to have a hot shooting war, it's going to have to be the millennials who are now starting to enter their 30s and 40s, and it's going to have to be pretty soon. If it doesn't happen pretty soon, we're probably going to slide into some sort of managed gerontocracy of sorts. But there are some other mechanical and technical problems. One is you got vast federal lands throughout the West, especially. It's not that easy to break them up. We have a military, which has lots of bases and personnel in places like California. We, of course, have the national debt, which was discussed earlier. We have an entitlement system, which is vast. And so these are problems that would have to be worked out. But what other types of revolution could take place? What other ways could we sort of secede from the current status quo or from the federal government? Well, I would say there are quite a few of them. And if we want to look to the blueprint for how this might happen, although it would be damnably slow, and speaking of gerontocracy, we'd all be gone perhaps, but we don't need to look any farther than our progressive friends. Some of you may know the name Garrett Garrett. He was a journalist around the turn of the century. I believe he was born in the 1850s and lived into about the 1930s, and he was a writer in the era and in the same voice and manner perhaps as H.L. Mencken. And one of the concepts he talked about as a really strong critic of FDR and the New Deal was something called a revolution within the form. And a revolution within the form is something that our progressive friends have absolutely mastered, and they especially did so over the 20th century and even what we call the beginning of the progressive era, beginning in the 1880s. So a revolution within the form is when the names or the forms of some things change. When the names or the forms of something stay the same, like the Constitution and the 9th and 10th Amendments, that all stays the same. They don't get abolished, but the meanings of things radically change. Like, for instance, the Commerce Clause, which was mentioned earlier today. Well, it took a pretty convoluted court decision to say, well, because you're growing something domestically within a state, you're not buying it in other states, so that affects interstate commerce. That's a stretch, to put it mildly. But nonetheless, that's an example of a revolution within the form. And really, all of what passes as constitutionalism today represents a revolution within the form. Nobody thought during the 1780s that Supreme Court jurisprudence, that court cases would supplant the Constitution itself. There was always going to be a difference. Whereas today we say, well, the Constitution is what the Supreme Court says it is. And that was never intended, and of course that's not true. But nonetheless, we have revolutions within the form. And we can go back to really as late or as recently as the 1880s. The Sherman antitrust period represented a huge change in how America went about business. And you fast forward a little bit, we get into all kinds of progressive revolutions in the 20th century in the United States. We get into the creation of a central bank and the Federal Reserve, an absolutely revolutionary institution. We get an income tax. We get a couple of progressive world wars of choice. I don't like the term convenience, but in a sense they were wars of convenience. As a matter of fact, the New Republic magazine, which was founded in 1914, one of its first tasks, it was kind of an unholy state, military, corporate nexus magazine. It still exists. The New Republic was formed in part to gin up support for U.S. entry into World War I. Because those stubborn Americans, about 60% of whom had some German ancestry, weren't necessarily thrilled about the idea of going to war with their first cousins. So we needed the New Republic to come along and explain to us why this was an important thing for America to do. That's a revolution within the form. Then, of course, we have the New Deal, We have FDR, which results in Social Security, retirement insurance. We have a series of Supreme Court cases that obliterate the Lochner era, what we call the Lochner era, that obliterate the idea of economic substantive due process. We fast forward a little bit farther into the 1960s. We get the LBJ entitlement period, the Great Society. We get things like Medicare and Medicaid and food stamps and AFDC. All of these things wildly, of course, extra-constitutional, wildly beyond the power of Congress to enact under Article 1, Section 8. But nonetheless, these revolutionary things are accepted by the majority of Americans because they take place. These revolutions occur within the form of what we're used to, the Congress and the Senate and voting and elections and all of these silly things. So then ultimately, of course, progressives win the culture wars, and they come to dominate the 20th century in a way that we don't even really fully understand, even as we live in it, because progressivism is so dominant in our culture that it's kind of like, it's like the furniture or the potted plants. It's all around us. Everything we say and do takes place within the framework of the debate as they've set it. So basically, progressives spent the 20th century getting everything they wanted. But they're never satisfied, are they? They're never satiated. There's always something more. It never ends. And of course, the past is always retrograde and sinister. The future is always better. If only those pesky human beings would evolve a little bit and get with the program. They keep hanging around longer than we think. And the election of Trump shocked the you-know-what out of them, because it turns out there's more deplorables hanging around in society than they thought. Brexit had a similar effect in the United Kingdom. So what happened was, on the election day in 2016, we had this very sort of facile narrative. You know, that election was decided really by 6 swing states that Trump won, which Obama had won just 4 years previously. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Iowa. And really 3 of those 6 would have been enough. Just Wisconsin, Iowa, and Michigan, just those 3 states would have been enough for Trump to prevail. And the difference in votes between Trump and Hillary in those 3 states was only about 75,000 people. And if you take all 6 states, the difference in actual raw votes was only about 500,000 people. So imagine, because of 500,000 people in a country of 320 million people, we woke up the day after the 2016 election and had this profoundly different narrative in the media. Because if Hillary Clinton had won, the narrative would have gone something like this. Well, of course, the progressive arc is inevitable. It was her time. America's a center-left country, and Americans are too smart to fall for this flim-flam real estate con man. And of course, just as polls predicted, Hillary Clinton was the wise choice, and the whole world reflects this. And progressivism proceeds apace. That would have been the narrative, the narrative of inevitability, the arc of progressivism that we've been sold throughout the 20th century. But instead, we woke up to this narrative because of 500,000 people's votes. Oh my God. America, it turns out, is this deeply regressive, retrograde, even racist country with these red state people who are voting for this guy who is clearly unfit, and they clearly rejected reason and common sense and the sparkling charisma of Hillary Clinton. So why did they do this? Well, I wish it had more meaning than perhaps it does. But I'm an optimist that way. I think the meaning of Trump has nothing to do with the man or his policies or his cabinet or what he says this day or that day or his tweets. I think it represents, as did Brexit, the beginning of the great pushback. And I hope it's the beginning of something more. I truly do. Okay, and that pushback is not necessarily ideological. It's not ideological in the sense that I would want it to be, in terms of my own perspective. And that's okay, because something had to change. That's what's the meaning of Trump. And here we are, after being just abused, beaten like a rented mule for the 20th century, to even hear libertarians in my camp not understand the Trump phenomenon galls me to no end. It really does. I had to get that out there. So let's have a thought experiment. Some of you may have heard me discuss this before, but this is one of my favorite thought experiments. And I've tried this in front of left-wing college students. I've tried it in front of libertarian audiences and economics audiences, college campuses around the country. And I really enjoy it. Let's take a tale of two regions. Okay, the first one we'll call the wonderful Republic of Switzerland. Okay, how many people in this room have heard of Alain Berset? Does that name ring a bell? Alain Berset. See, you were all able to wake up unencumbered by the knowledge that Alain Berset is the president of Switzerland. The reason you don't know who the president of Switzerland is because it doesn't much matter. They have a 7-member federal council, and they rotate. Those 7 members rotate. The presidency is just 1 year. So in Switzerland, there are approximately 26 cantons, which are the states, so to speak, of Switzerland. And then they call the cities communes. So what's so interesting to me is that if you go to the Swiss government's website, which of course is helpfully in Italian, French, English, German, etc. If you go to the Swiss government's website, they have a section on federalism. And in that section, they even talk about, they say, well, other than military matters and managing the Swiss franc, Our policy is to move everything down to either the cantonal or the communal level as much as possible. In other words, we defer to them, and our job is to do as little as possible. And unlike here, where you send about 80 cents of every dollar in taxes to the FedGov, and then maybe the other 20 to your state, unless you're fortunate enough to live in Texas. Texas gets you in other ways. In Switzerland, that's kind of flipped. You send the majority of your taxes to your communal government, less so to the cantonal government, and very little to the federal government. And what's more is on the Swiss government website, they even talk about, we think federalism as a principle is effective in assisting with social cohesion. Imagine that. Imagine Trump or Hillary campaigning a couple of years ago and being in Des Moines, Iowa one day and saying, we don't really know what's best for Iowa. We never lived here. It's sort of agricultural. But, what we're going to do is my campaign promise to you is to allow the Iowa government, or better yet, your county or local government, the greatest degree of freedom possible, and the federal government Uncle Sam won't be much involved. No. Our national politicians do the exact opposite. They wade into places like Des Moines, Iowa, and some staffer just briefed them 10 minutes ago, but oh my God, this flyover place I got to go to. And they gave him some goofy facts, and so they go in there and presume, perfect knowledge. We're gonna create a healthcare system for 320 million people. We're gonna go remake Afghanistan in the image of the University of Virginia and Thomas Jefferson somehow. I mean, this is hubris, folks, but it's also universalism. And what strikes me about reading Yoram Hazony's book that I mentioned earlier was that what is starting to become every bit as important as the ideology or the politics of how we're governed is the level at which we are governed. In other words, this question's almost become more important than left versus right or liberal versus conservative. So I really think the Swiss have it right. And as an example of this, in Switzerland, people at the local communal level can even go and vote and have a say on whether a longtime resident can become a citizen. The Swiss immigration process is very difficult and very time-consuming. But can you imagine, after you've been there as a resident working hard in your job for about 10 years, people who actually know you in your local community could go and say, oh, yes, I think so-and-so should be allowed citizenship. They're very hardworking. They're a great person, respected, trusted in the community. That sounds bizarre to us, but why should it be so? It seems to me a good way to go. So let's contrast that. And by the way, Switzerland's about 8 million people, so it's maybe a little bit beyond the 5 million. But nonetheless, 8 million people is plenty big enough to do all kinds of things, including having a very capable system of national defense that's aided by some mountainous terrain, but nonetheless, a very capable system of national defense on which they do not spend the stupid amounts of money that we do to have aircraft carriers, which wouldn't do you much good, I suppose, in an alpine setting. But let's take another region that's not so fortunate as Switzerland. Let's take the San Francisco Bay Area. an area I've had the pleasure to live in, and it's very beautiful. It has a lot of natural geography and things going for it. But it wore me down. It wore me down to a nub to talk to people who had the mindset and the mentality of the average person in San Francisco. And my wife absolutely lost her mind. Our son was little at the time. She absolutely lost her mind going to the playground and everything every day. I mean, it was just unbelievable. Because at the playground, for all of their talk, there's an astonishing number of Hispanic nannies rather than actual moms at the playground. And so you have all these Hispanic nannies taking care of the kids, and the kids are all named Cooper and Madison and Ashley. And, there's no Joes or Mikes or anything, but this is how things are. So San Francisco Bay Area is about 7 million people, and it consists of 9 counties. And these counties, in pure politics, are actually very homogenous as you might want to get for a region of that size. And again, with 7 million people, clearly capable of being a country on its own. Now, those 7 million people voted overwhelmingly for people like Nancy Pelosi, Dianne Feinstein, etc., for Barack Obama. They also voted overwhelmingly not to recall Governor Greg Davis. So if you'll remember that a special election a few years ago that resulted in Arnold Schwarzenegger was only a nominal Republican being put into office. So this is deep blue country, folks. As a matter of fact, Marin County, which is on the north end of the Golden Gate Bridge, is limousine liberal central. That's where the former Senator Barbara Boxer lives. I mean, this is one of the most grossly hypocritical parts of the country when it comes to NIMBYism. For example, Steven Spielberg has his studios there, and there are a lot of people who live in Marin County who are very glad that the BART, the underground, does not go across the Golden Gate Bridge. There's a lot of people who live in Marin County who are very happy that a low-income housing project that was going to be put in near Steven Spielberg's studios was rejected by the City of Nevada's council, etc. So they like the poor in the abstract, let's just say. But what if we allowed those 9 counties, those 7 million people, those deep blue progressives to have everything they wanted right here, right now? No more waiting. What if they could have highly progressive income tax rates? Really tax the hell out of, let's say, incomes over 100 or 200,000, whatever it might be. Let's say they could even have a wealth tax on just net wealth above a certain level. Let's say right here, right now, they could institute a single-payer healthcare system within those counties. What if they could make education, especially higher education, free? Just make it free. University of Berkeley would be included. Stanford would be included. Make them free. You'd get a lot of applicants. What if right here, right now, they could have the kind of relaxed abortion laws that they would overwhelmingly favor? What if they could have very strict, perhaps even outright prohibitions on firearms ownership? And as a matter of fact, anyone in this room who knows the work of Brian McClanahan, he'll tell you, nobody thought the Second Amendment applied to states. It doesn't apply to states. It didn't federalize gun laws. I should say nobody at the time of the ratification of the Second Amendment thought it applied to states. So they could have gun control right here, right now. They could have open borders with other parts of the country or with the seaport that they controlled. They could have hate speech laws and codes, put people in jail for saying bad things. They could have whatever sort of protections, we might call them neo-civil liberties for LGBT folks that they wanted to have. In other words, it would be entirely up to those 9 counties to do so. And more importantly, and I really mean this, they would no longer have to worry about a Senate race, a U.S. Senate race, let's say, in my home state now of Alabama. They wouldn't have to worry about Roy Moore. Okay, Roy Moore wouldn't be the one calling the shots. The only relationship they would have with the federal government, if they were a lot more like a Swiss commune or a Swiss canton, would be sort of military defense and the dollars that they used as run by the Fed. So who in this room would object to it? I mean, I haven't found anybody anywhere I've been that objects to this idea. Young people, black people, white people, conservatives, liberals, it just seems to be commonsensical to people. The San Francisco Bay Area ought not to have to govern itself by the same rules as Auburn, Alabama does. So why do we persist with this? What is it in the American psyche that makes us, is it manifest destiny? Is it this idea of westward expansion, which I think was actually a bad idea? We had a Louisiana Purchase, and then ultimately we come up with this nice round number of 50 states, including implausibly Alaska, which is not even connected to the United States and really ought to be part of Canada, I think. And then Hawaii, which was just a nice, let's face it, a refueling stop for our military. So we took over a rightful kingdom. And I visited Hawaii a couple times in the last few years. They're not real big fans of mainlanders. I can tell you that much. And there's a huge Hawaiian secession movement. They have a lot of internal fighting over who's a real Hawaiian. But beyond that, there are plenty of people in Hawaii who don't much like Uncle Sam. So why should this be so? Why should we be forced to live as one? Not necessarily in terms of getting rid of the federal government or seceding, but even in terms of localism. Well, I think the short answer for progressives was that they were winning, right? Why should we just have San Francisco and the coast when pretty soon we'll have it all? Okay, well, that's, as a political or pragmatic matter, that's a pretty good argument. We're winning. All this secession and federalism and states' rights and localism talk, that's for losers. Am I right? But then something happened, and it started to shake this arc of inevitability. And I think one of the first real tremors in that was the crash of 2007, 2008. Because we'd been told that the technocratic bureaucrats, the regulators of our money, had it all together, and we weren't going to have these crashes anymore. Remember? We'd also been told by Francis Fukuyama that we were upon the end of history and that Western liberal social democracy was going to prevail everywhere. We were told there weren't going to be more booms and busts, that there weren't going to be more conflagrations, that nationalism was dead. Well, the crash of 2008 sort of shook that narrative, and it made a lot of people start to wonder about these technocratic elites. And then Brexit comes along and shakes up a lot of people in Europe saying, wait a minute, this European project, this was cast in stone, we thought. What's going on here? And then Trump gets elected, and all of a sudden people wake up in the middle of the night with cold sweats because they thought that a certain narrative was unfolding in front of them, inexorably. And it turns out it's not inexorable. It turns out that people are stubborn animals, that nations sometimes can be stubborn things. And then, in fact, if you agree with Murray Rothbard, as I do, nations can be very different things than states. In other words, nations can be natural. They can be organic. They can be things that arise spontaneously, in a sense, in the marketplace as a result of things that are imposed by politicians writing geographic lines, oftentimes after the end results of wars. And so as Americans, we're really bad at history. We don't care about history. Forget world history, even our own. So we imagine that the way things are is the way they always will be. And that goes to the 50 states. It goes to the lines on the map. But we forget sometimes, in our lack of knowledge, in our lack of information, that America is a relatively new country. I heard a commentator on the radio talking the other day about how the Chinese still view us kind of as a startup when it comes to geopolitics. They're kind of waiting around, biding their time to see if we make it or not. Okay? And let's not forget that much of what we call Western Europe today has radically redrawn lines that just came out of World War II. Those lines were very, very different just a little more than 100 years ago. Let's look at the former Yugoslavia, which was broken up into 6 countries. In about a tenth of the time it took them to yammer about Brexit. My God, this Brexit thing is still going on. So we imagine, because we're dumb and because we're misinformed, we imagine that things will always be as they've been forever and ever. And I think that's really the hope. The idea that some of these small revolutions, which are very, very difficult to defeat by government because people just want them, will turn into big revolutions. And what I seriously and stridently hope for myself and, of course, for my own kids and maybe someday grandkids, is that these small revolutions are bloodless. Thank you very much.